Hello, Internet. It's Daniel with Driving and Dragons. And today, I just want to take a second, just a little musing I had while I was out here cruising between a few investment properties I was looking at. And I was wondering, how will the dragon eat itself? Is Dungeons and Dragons finished as the leading role-playing game moving forward? Tell you what I think on the other side. So, Wizards of the Coast, Dungeons and Dragons. Is the dragon going to eat its own tail? Will Dungeons and Dragons continue to be the predominant and premier tabletop role-playing game? It's really hard to say anything but yes, just because of the pure name recognition and the amount of capital behind the venture. Wizards of the Coast by itself has a market capitalization, in other words, the what it trades for, the kind of resources it has. The total worth of Wizards of the Coast is more than every other role-playing game publisher combined. Unless you start really just piling on hundreds and $100 or $1,000 here and there from really small places. I mean, it's really difficult to truly visualize how much bigger than the rest of the industry Wizards of the Coast is, and that's not counting anything that comes in from Hasbro, just Wizards of the Coast itself. However, there is something that I've been looking at, some of those reading the tea leaves type situations that I've kind of thought about since the beginning of the OGL situation. Historically in the past, the success of a Dungeons and Dragons edition has been largely driven by new players, and new players being brought in by those loyalists who have always been there. And that's where your sustainability comes in. Your sustainability kind of comes from how hard that loyal core base is. That's what keeps Dungeons and Dragons carrying through, whether they're successful or not. But new players are really determine the success. Bunch of new players came in 3rd edition. It was one of the most massive ones on the planet. It had a lot of what was essentially free advertising for Dungeons and Dragons by the open game license, allowing enterprising dungeon masters to monetize their hobby and turn into publishers like Paizo and Green Ronin and Atlas Games and all these others. And then you also had 4th edition, where Dungeons and Dragons literally was failing out. All the real new 3.5 blood ran off to go to do other things because they were pissed off at the way things were done. That free advertising was gone. You had a core of D&D loyalists that kind of stuck around and kept them through, but that was the closest we ever came to a Dungeons and Dragons collapse. Well, now I think they're facing pardon the pun, but a two-headed dragon of their own. A two-headed dragon attacking them in a dungeon of their own making. What I see is, on one hand, you have the OGL debacle, and despite everything they've done, crawfishing on it, going back, saying that they're going to enshrine it forever, releasing a bunch of stuff to the Creative Commons, everything they're doing to try and keep that core base, get that core base back after their mistake, they still did a tremendous amount of damage, I feel, to the trust and loyalty of these long-time DMs and long-time players, and more importantly, a lot of these supporting publishers. A lot of these supporting publishers are still moving forward with other projects. A lot of independent creators have shifted to do other either OSR or old version or system neutral and agnostic projects that were originally Dungeons and Dragons projects, which weakens D&D as a whole, because these are the people who are going to bring new players in. They can combat a little bit of this by trying to be totally backwards compatible with 5e and maintaining some of that 5e player base without losing some of that new player base, creating a new breed of loyalist D&D player. But at the same time, those core guys that have been there since the beginning, those core guys that have stuck with Dungeons & Dragons through and through and really never played anything else, a lot of them got disillusioned by the OGL situation. Even more so than some that got driven off by the increasing tendency in 5th edition to push towards a hyper-player-centric game. Which is only going to get worse because Wizards of the Coast has made no secret that what they look at is, hey, we monetize Dungeon Masters, but these players, there's 6 people at a table and we're only really monetizing 1. We're not really monetizing those players. We got to find ways to get into their pockets to bring them in, bring them to the party spending money in order to expand our revenue. And there's a lot of people who are not buying into that because the way they've gone about it is to make an extremely player-centric game, which leads to the second problem that Wizards of the Coast has. They have created a monster of entitled players who feel like everything should cater towards them. We're talking like the worst Gen Z stereotype on steroids in terms of crybaby, narcissistic, entitled behavior, participation trophy generation players. That is what has been bred and encouraged by Wizards of the Coast. Introducing intentional power creep so the player can always buy their way to being more powerful and then will turn around and complain when a DM doesn't want to allow it. And there's a legitimacy to that complaint. Why? It's no longer just, the DM won't let me use my overpowered combo or my weird min-maxing idea or my very liberal interpretation of a rule to make something work the way it shouldn't. It's turned into, I spent real-world money on official Dungeons & Dragons stuff to do this. And you can see some of that entitled mentality doubling back and biting Wizards in the butt by looking at the open stuff for the playtest. None of these players, when you read the comments and the things that have been said, when you look in the forums and the threads, you constantly have to remind these players that the One D&D playtest is a playtest. They are putting out ideas to be tested and adjusted and corrected and fixed. And maybe this works, maybe this doesn't work. But every last one, they've ruined this, they've ruined that. There's no way I'm playing it because they're doing this, that, or the other. This idea is so stupid. I'm just going to stick to 5th edition. These people can't even accept a playtest that doesn't do what they want it to do. They won't even put in the feedback. They'll just throw them under the bus. That's what they've bred into the player base with some of their activities, is if it's not instant gratification and 100% what they want right away, they don't bother to try and fix. They don't bother to try and adjust or to be part of the solution. They just take their ball and go home and sit back and blame the big evil corporation for not giving them exactly what they wanted, even though when they're given the opportunity to tell big bad evil corporation exactly what they want, instead all they do is complain about whatever test fire idea came out. So I just see it kind of on the horizon. Like I said, I see it in the tea leaves. It's by no means definite. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't even say it's necessarily likely to happen here. But when I look at this situation, I just see a bunch of elements that could lead to another, even worse than the 4th edition collapse in the Dungeons & Dragons community. I think it'll be great for other role-playing games in a lot of ways. But for the community as a whole, I don't think it'll be that good, because I think you'll have far more that go back to video games, far more that go back to other hobbies and other pursuits, far more that just simply abandon tabletop role-playing game than players who try something new or branch out or even stick with 5th edition. I think you're going to see a lot more of an exodus than people just planting their roots or trying other things. I think you're just going to see them move out of the hobby altogether. What do you think? Do you think that these elements, that entitled player base, the continuing piling of basically power creep and other issues onto DMs that make it very difficult, especially for new DMs, to balance their games, the residual anger of a lot of the old school community over the OGL debacle, do you think these things can combine to a serious, possibly even mortal blow to Dungeons and Dragons as the premier tabletop role-playing game? Or do you think the entire industry shrinks and it just becomes, the fish gets smaller, but the pond gets way smaller? So they're still the biggest fish in a very small pond. It's just, instead of a shark, now they're just a bass? Or do you think that this doesn't really have an impact and One D&D rolls on like a juggernaut? 5th edition supports it because it's quote-unquote backwards compatible, and the older crowd just kind of gets left in the dust, except for those few that are so D&D loyalist and obsessed that D&D could, Wizards of the Coast could slap D&D on a dog turd and they'd still buy it. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Just some passing thoughts on a rainy Sunday. See you guys next time.